Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Developing Low Carbon Industrial Hubs in Southeast Asia, Insights from Malaysia and Indonesia, organized by the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. I'm Jia Hui, your MC for today. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping matters. Firstly, please note that this webinar is not under the Chatham House rule, and the recording will be uploaded on YouTube after the event. Next, if you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. And to ask questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A function, stating your name and affiliation together with your question, as well as which speaker you would like to pose your question to. You can send in your questions at any time. Lastly, if you would like to stay informed on our future activities, do sign up for updates at the links which I will be sharing in the chat box shortly. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for this session. Dr. Christopher Len is Senior Visiting Fellow and Acting Coordinator at the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program here at ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. I will now invite him to begin the webinar. Dr. Len, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Len. I am the Acting Coordinator for the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute. Thank you for joining today's webinar on developing low-carbon industrial hubs in Southeast Asia with a special focus on Malaysia and Indonesia. Low-carbon industrial hubs are becoming vital for Southeast Asia's path to decarbonization, economic resilience, and future competitiveness. These hubs bring together clean energy, resource efficiency, and innovative technologies, and have to be supported by strong partnerships across the government, industry, and finance. Today's webinar will explore Southeast Asia's progress in developing these hubs with a focus on the importance of regional collaboration, effective policy frameworks, and new clean technologies. We will be highlighting developments in Malaysia and Indonesia as key examples. We have three speakers with us today. The first speaker is Mr. Peter Godfrey, founder and CEO of Carbon Sink Technologies and Managing Director for Asia Pacific at the Energy Institute. Our second speaker is Mr. Alex Zapantis, Head of Asia Pacific at the Global CCS Institute. The final speaker will be Dr. Juniko Pratama, Industrial Decarbonization Program Manager at the Institute for Essential Services Reform based in Indonesia. Each speaker will have 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a Q&A session after all presentations. So in the interest of time, let's start. Let's begin with Peter Godfrey. Peter, could you explain to us what low-carbon industrial hubs are and why they matter? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, Chris, and good morning all, and good morning some of the participants and attendees who I know. Good to see you. And as you rightly say, as well as my representation of the Energy Institute, here in this part of the world, I have also set up a company specifically looking at carbon hubs under this company called Carbon Sink Technologies. And my presentation today is actually going to be the first presentation that I have given publicly on the subject of this company. So I'm going to just share my slides now. Hopefully I am now sharing. Can you confirm, Chris, that slides are on?
Yes, they are on. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. So let me start by saying that we're obviously living through a period of profound change. The systems that sustain life are fraying, and our old ways of thinking, whether one sort of believes in climate change or not, are no longer serving us terribly well for various reasons, including geopolitical ones. So we need new approaches, new ways of shaping the future. And today, infrastructure, as we knew it in the past, is no longer just about power plants and pipelines. It's about how basically industrial processes, energy, water, digital systems, and even food and waste and management work together to underpin our future. So these sectors are increasingly being seen as being interdependent, as seen in the surging demand for clean energy to power, AI, water to cool data centers, use of heat, etc., etc., etc. So at this pivotal moment, the decisions of policymakers, investors, and industry will shape how that infrastructure of the future will develop. And to me, developing projects of this scale, which is all about the development of low carbon industrial hubs, is a complex process that requires a number of stakeholders, as Chris mentioned in his intro, that need to work together. But saying that, these hubs, by integrating clean energy solutions, can enhance resource efficiency, can embed circular economy principles, and can create a transformative opportunity to reduce gas and allow us to effectively reinforce our energy security and stimulate sustainable and economic growth wherever we are. So today, what I'd like to do is to delve into that subject in a little bit of detail with a few case studies. And rather than looking at Indonesia and Malaysia, which obviously we can talk about later, I'm actually going to talk about the UK and some examples of what is happening there, because I actually think they're very relevant to what we can be doing in this part of the world. So as I was saying in my introductory slide, to basically start looking at industrial hubs, we need to think about why they matter. They basically can achieve a lot by strategically enabling a whole range of industries to work more closely together in some form of ecosystem-focused approach. They allow us to basically integrate clean energy, resource efficiency, and indeed circular economy principles. And they also then obviously allow us to reduce GHG emissions and also create a more secure future for us all. But recognize that many of those topics and many of those subjects are dealt with by different technology players, different corporates, and different R&D that is required to actually upgrade all of those things. So each of them have different sets of stakeholders that need to play together in this game. But what is important is to recognize there's a major framework that we need to deal around these hubs that form the basis of where we want to get to. Each hub, wherever they are, and every hub, wherever they are in this part of the world as well as internationally, will be different, do four key things. One of which is integrating energy and obviously looking at renewables, low emissions power, and stable green supplies as key. They're all about creating the maximum possible use of resources. They're all about trying to share infrastructure across an ecosystem that you're developing as the hub. And then, of course, what you're trying to do is to create that in a sustainable and resilient fashion, which will allow that hub to develop and become a sustainable, growing, resilient hub for the future of industry development. And the way I've kind of put this together in terms of looking at it from a basically sort of simple generic point of view is to look at four key boxes. And when you look at the sorts of involvements of different technologies, you can see how these play out. The first one, and probably the most fundamental one, is clean electrons. Clean electrons and electrification will increasingly drive all industrial processes going forwards. As we know, electrification is key. And to a certain extent, many of the conventional industry processes have the ability to change to some form of use of electrification above and beyond the old conventional fuels that they used before. Second in the box is clean molecules and fuels and feedstocks. At the end of the day, every manufacturing process in the future will want to be able to source clean molecules and the cleanest possible fuels and feedstocks on which it manages an industrial process. So from a net zero perspective, it has to decarbonize as little as possible going forwards. And this clearly is key and a key component of any hub, wherever you want to begin to start developing them. Number three, and we're going to be talking a lot about obviously carbon capture removal and also potentially not just storage, but utilization, because obviously increasingly we're looking at utilizing CO2 to create some of those clean fuels and feedstocks in the future, not just about storage. also need to be integrated into this hub going forwards. And then finally, lastly but not leastly, this whole issue of circularity and the need to begin to start looking at resource efficiency in order to play. So to me, in very simple terms, what a carbon hub needs to look like is something like this from a generic perspective. Now, what does this mean when we begin to start going forwards and begin to start looking at what are the key enablers to make these hubs work? And what we need is clearly a few things. I mean, firstly and foremostly is obviously a set of regulations and policies that encourage the development of these hubs. Because as I said before, at the end of the day, unless one creates that sort of ecosystem-based vision, all of the industries are going to carry on running their businesses more or less as business as usual. Their shareholders will demand it. So it is important for policy and regulation to begin to start moving in this direction. And the reason that I'm going to talk about the UK is my belief that policy and regulation is moving in that direction as a result of a lot of lessons learned over the last 5 to 10 years. So I'll get back to that in a minute. The second one is a recognition that instead of utilities companies and businesses looking at how infrastructure is developed in their conventional infrastructure centric way, like water, power, heat, energy, what we need to do is to begin to recognize that in a hub, those infrastructures play together. They are part of an integrated solution. They are not single technology based. So basically, we need to be open to the idea of restructuring the way we manage infrastructure going forwards. Now, thirdly, and very importantly, is that when we begin to do that and we begin to start doing numbers 1 and 2, suddenly we begin to start looking at the ecosystem as a pretty large scaled project, an infrastructure project. And basically that mitigates and improves the ability for financing organizations, whether they be national, private, or indeed international and multilateral, to begin to start putting together blended finance models at scale to manage those kinds of large scale infrastructure investments. So the big benefits of doing 1 and 2 is number 3. It actually creates the kind of framework on where you can begin to start thinking about financing a lot more seriously. It also encourages the stakeholders, the various individual stakeholders, all of these conventional companies that are working in all these technologies to work more closely, to collaborate, because suddenly they have finance available to do that job. So eventually you begin to start encouraging the very sort of consortium that you need to start developing this. Number 5, of course, is that inevitably you want to bring the costs down, and that's all about making sure that you're focusing on scale, focusing on allowing technology and innovation to actively participate in the hub, and in so doing, make the most of what is possible in terms of scaling up their various technologies. And finally, what's important is the spatial, i.e. size of the hub and how it all links together, and what that means in terms of development, not only in terms of geography, but also time, temporal planning. So inevitably, a hub is not something that develops tomorrow. It's something that evolves over time. And it's important to understand how that fits together within this context. So just to summarize that very simply, what I'm really trying to say is that there is no one size fits all to these hubs. Every hub will develop in a different way. But at the end of the day, all of those things that we've just talked about now can be done for each and individual hub. And that's what my company is beginning to start looking at, you know, the resources and the available technology readiness, the financing side, what needs to be done on the policy and regulatory side, et cetera, et cetera. So we're moving into that framework that begins us to allow doing that. And indeed, I am doing work right now in Malaysia, both on Peninsular Malaysia and in Sarawak in Borneo, and a little bit of work here in Singapore, and hopefully going to be doing some work in Indonesia in the future, if Indonesia allow me in at some stage. But to me, there's a lot of work to be done on getting the plan sorted out and optimized within the context of what I've just said now. So let me move straight off to another part of the world and just talk a little bit about what is happening in my country, the UK, because I think the UK has a lot of lessons to learn. And where I think certainly our friend from the Global CCS Institute will see some parallels to this, a lot of this work started from CCS, in fact, when the clusters were beginning to start emerging, specifically with a CCS focus. And the track 1, track 2 system emerged as a way of moving CCUS, particularly forwards in places like Scotland, the northeast of England and Wales, etc. Where this is however moved is a recognition that these are not just about CCS. You know, if you look at where the hubs in Scotland, where the hubs in Humber, where the hubs in Teesside are developing, you can begin to start seeing that it's not just about CCS. Hydrogen is beginning to link in. Gas to power is beginning to link in. Shared T&S is beginning to, you know, sort of transportation and storage for CO2 is beginning to link in, obviously, through aggregation. And a lot of different things are beginning to develop. So you're beginning to start recognizing, and I think the British government is beginning to recognize the importance of looking at these hubs in a far more holistic way. And this is indeed what is happening. And I'm very happy to talk a little bit more about this if we have time, but it's a very important piece. Lastly, but not leastly, I want to go on about what I see as the big key advantage of these hubs from a regulatory perspective. And it's, to me, the key message when we begin to start looking at Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And that measure is that the moment you begin to start forming these hubs at scale, you begin to recognize that not only are they hubs, but potentially they can be looked at as special economic zones of national value, of national economic importance to the host countries. So it's no longer just an energy issue, it becomes an economic issue that can be managed very similarly to a free port as a special economic zone. It's of a size that allows you to provide regulatory and tax incentives. It's of a size that will allow streamlined permitting and government to accelerate investment, and it's of a size that will actually create finance and innovation and workforce development without having to change the regulations of the whole country. So to me, the big advantage in this part of the world, and it's increasingly being seen as the big advantage in terms of actually making a competitive economy, is the fact that special economic zones provide policy, finance, and a government framework that will allow technology and future industry to develop, accelerate green investment flows, de-risk emerging technologies, and build a competitive, future-proofed ecosystem for economic development in the future. I'll leave it at that. Look forward to questions, look forward to the discussion. I hope that at least gives you a taste of why I'm very passionate about the subject of industrial hub development in the low carbon energy and economic space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your presentation. I like how you shared with us the core framework and enablers for developing low carbon industrial hubs. And also you highlighted some case studies from the UK. And also, more importantly, I think besides looking at hubs as hubs, you are linking them to the concept of special economic zones. So thank you very much for that. I think the following two speakers will shed more light for us in the context of Southeast Asia. I will move to the second speaker now. We have Alex Zapantis. He will discuss carbon capture and storage for low carbon industrial hubs in Southeast Asia. Alex, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I've got to say, congratulations for that last presentation, Peter. It really was very good. I think you hit all the high points in terms of the importance of hubs. So there'll be a little bit of repetition in my presentation, but hopefully not too much. What I'll do is I'll share my presentation now. Hopefully you're seeing this now. My name is Alex Zapantis. I am the head of Asia Pacific for the Global CCS Institute, and I'm stepping in for Aisha Hatta, who is our head of Southeast Asia, but unfortunately she had to attend to some personal matters, was unavailable at short notice. So very quickly, I'll introduce the Global CCS Institute. We are a not-for-profit think tank, similar to the SEAS, actually. Our mission is to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage for climate mitigation purposes. So at our core, we are a climate advocacy think tank, really, but we focus explicitly on carbon capture and storage and that particular technology. We have about 200 members, more than 200 members around the world. They're mostly companies, but we also have research institutes and several national and subnational governments who are our members. We provide member services, and we also provide consulting advisory, but only related to CCS. CCS is quite literally all that we do. Okay, so I think I'd like to start with just briefly a reminder of exactly what CCS is, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So what is CCS? Well, I think it's important to note that CCS is actually not one technology. It's actually a family of technologies that can separate carbon dioxide from pretty much any industrial source or directly from the atmosphere, compress it to a dense phase. So this is where it has a density of about 0.7, so almost as dense as water, transport it in a pipeline or in a ship or even in containers on trucks. Happens quite a lot in China, to injection sites where it is injected into suitable geological storage formations at least 800 meters below the Earth's surface. So the reason why it has to be at least 800 meters below is because at that depth, the carbon dioxide will remain in a dense phase. It won't become a gas, which is much more efficient in terms of storage efficiency. Most storage actually occurs at about 2 kilometers. 2 kilometer depth is pretty typical. And we're not injecting into caverns or caves in the subsurface. We're injecting into porous rock. So think of it as a sponge, but a sponge made of rock. And the CO2 is trapped in the pore space initially, using the same forces and processes that have kept natural gas and natural accumulation of carbon dioxide and hydrocarbons stored in the subsurface for literally millions of years. Okay. The other thing I'd like to note about CCS also is that whilst it's only become a hot topic in the last maybe decade, it's not new. The technology to separate carbon dioxide from gas streams was first used commercially about 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago, in the oil and gas industry, where it was separating carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide from methane. The first injection, the first full chain CCS project, started operating more than 50 years ago in the US for enhanced oil recovery. Now, the financial driver for that back then was all about the additional oil produced as a consequence of the CO2 storage. That facility is still operating today, by the way. But it's important to note that when you inject CO2 whilst doing enhanced oil recovery, eventually all of that CO2 ends up in the pore space that was previously occupied by the hydrocarbons and is permanently stored. Although it might be produced with the oil and gas, separated from that oil and gas and re-injected a number of times before it finally is permanently stored in the subsurface. And of course, CCS started operating for pure climate mitigation purposes for the first time more than 20 years ago, nearly 30 years ago, actually, at Sleipner, which is offshore Norway, at the scale of up to 1 million tons per year. And that facility continues to operate today. So it's not new technology. It's not science fiction. It's very well established, and it's mature in many circumstances. So how are we tracking globally in terms of CCS? Well, I'm pleased to say that since 2017, there's been sustained annual year-on-year significant growth in investment in CCS and in the capacity of projects being developed and the number of projects being developed. You can see on the left side of this chart the last 3 years. Looking at this year, well, actually looking at June 2025, there's actually more now, but we won't be announcing those until our status report is released next month. Back in June 2025, there were 70 commercial CCS facilities operating around the world. There were 48 in construction, and there was over 600 in the various stages of development, FEED studies or feasibility studies. I should point out that these are all commercial facilities. These are not pilots or demonstrations or experiments. These are commercial large-scale facilities. The capacity of those facilities that are operating is only about 60 million tonnes per year of carbon dioxide captured and stored. When the 48 that are currently in construction enter operation, which is expected mostly before 2030, then the capacity will exceed 100 million tonnes per year of CO2 being injected and stored every year. You can see from the map that the geographic distribution of those facilities is pretty tightly focused, mostly on North America and Europe, and there's a very simple reason for that. North America and Europe have the most supportive policy and regulatory environments that help to support a business case for investment. So these are very large, capital-intensive, long-lived assets. There must be a strong business case. There must be a return on investment. Otherwise, the investment just doesn't happen. And those circumstances have existed most strongly and for the longest time in North America and in Europe, although we are now starting to see a strengthening of that business case, a strengthening of policy and regulation in this region also, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And of course, the last point I'd like to make about this slide is the versatility of CCS. It can be applied to pretty much any industrial process of sufficient scale. And we see projects operating or in development across all of the industries that you can see listed at the bottom right of that slide. Okay, so hubs and networks. What is the opportunity here for hubs and networks? If you look at how CCS has been deployed, originally the model was a single source, a pipe, and a single sink. That was the model 10, 15 years ago. That is no longer the case. Today, almost every CCS project that comes onto the landscape is part of a network, and there's a very simple reason for that. There are significant benefits associated with hubs and networks. You benefit from economies of scale. You benefit from a reduction of business risk because there are multiple parties involved in an ecosystem of businesses, all contributing to the resilience of this network. And you also enable operations, countries, facilities that may not have access to proximate CO2 storage to access proximate CO2 storage elsewhere via common user infrastructure. So there are many, many general examples, reasons why hubs and networks make sense. They absolutely reduce the total cost of achieving net zero targets. We know this because we've modeled it. In fact, we've modeled Southeast Asia with and without transboundary transport, without hubs and networks, and the net cost over the modeling period out to 2065, I think our model goes to, is round numbers about $1 trillion more to achieve net zero targets, with the minimum capacity of CCS required for the model to close compared to the near optimum level of CCS for the model to close. So it reduces the cost of abatement. It creates a new opportunity for trade in CO2 transport and storage services. It underwrites the establishment of CO2 management infrastructure, which is then available for industry to utilize. So you can imagine in the future, hard to abate industries, cement, steel, chemicals, hydrogen, etc., when they're about to build their next facility, because the current facilities are coming to the end of their operational life. Of course, they'll be looking for all of the factors of production that they need for that facility to be competitive. One they'll also be looking for is the availability of CO2 management and storage infrastructure and services, because they know that they're going to need to have a CO2 management solution going forwards. Policy and regulation simply will not allow the continued unabated emission of CO2 at levels that we have been able to emit over the past 100 or 200 years. So these low emission industry hubs, which will grow up around that infrastructure, will attract investment from existing industry that need a decarbonisation option, but also potential new industries. So for example, very low emissions hydrogen using CCS and its derivative products, ammonia, urea, etc., etc. And all of this, of course, serves to create new jobs and to protect existing jobs, to reduce the exposure of countries to things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe. There will be more of these, I believe, developing around the world over time. And very importantly, these hubs, which are usually around existing industrial complexes, will be enabled to continue to operate to provide the employment, the investment, the economic benefits to those regions and provide that just transition for communities, which is absolutely critical, because if we can't provide a just transition for communities, those communities then become opponents of effective action on climate change, and climate change is hard enough already without opponents. But in order for these hubs to proceed, there are some requirements that must be met. Of course, we need commercially available technology. We can certainly tick that box. You can buy capture technology off the shelf from various vendors with a very broad range of applications. You need human capital. Talking about Malaysia in particular, because I'll focus on Malaysia in this presentation, they absolutely have the human capital that is required in terms of the expertise from the oil and gas industry, mostly to design and operate storage facilities, but also expertise around the capture side as well. You need that human capital also in the government. Regulators need to know how to regulate CCS, and it's the same skill set essentially as is required for oil and gas. Malaysia has a mature oil and gas industry. They have the human capital required to develop this industry. Of course, you need sufficient geological storage resources. You need clear and predictable regulation of the entire value chain, and to enable the transport of CO2 across borders, you must have government-to-government agreements that define such things as how the liability and reporting of CO2 will be managed between governments as it crosses international borders, to ensure the integrity of carbon accounting, and to agree on the attribution of mitigation outcomes. Who gets to claim the emissions abatement benefit delivered through the CCS value chain? Of course, you need capital, finance, insurance, etc. And you need also an absence of significant community opposition. It's very clear that if there is significant community opposition, that can derail or even completely stop a project from proceeding. So how does Malaysia score on those requirements? Well, it scores pretty well, actually. It certainly has the commercially available technologies I mentioned earlier, certainly has the human capital, the expertise in the right industries to operate, design, operate, regulate a CCS value chain, has enormous geological storage capacity. The Malay, Sabah, Sarawak basins offer hundreds of billions of tons potentially of carbon dioxide storage capacity, which is more than enough to meet Malaysia's domestic requirements and serve an international market as well. Clear and predictable regulation is well advanced. It's not quite all there yet. So Malaysia has enacted just this year its CCS Act, CCUS Act, actually, which establishes the sort of omnibus regulation for CO2 import, transport and storage. And the detailed regulations are currently being developed. So that yellow box will go green relatively soon. Government-to-government agreements, they're not in place yet, but there are many discussions and negotiations going on with Singapore, with South Korea, for example, in order to negotiate and agree the terms of those agreements so that cross-border CO2 transport can proceed. Capital finance insurance is challenging. So the first projects that are proceeding in Asia, in Malaysia and elsewhere, Thailand and Indonesia, they have specific circumstances that make them investable. Low cost, relatively low cost, operated mostly by national oil and gas companies to inject their reservoir CO2. So this is the CO2 that is produced with the methane, which they would normally just vent to atmosphere. So there's very little additional cost for capture. All of the cost, really, most of the cost is in the transport and storage. In order to enable the next tranche of projects, which will need to capture from higher cost capture sources, there needs to be some stronger policy in place in order to enable more capital to flow and to enable these projects to be financed. And in terms of absence of significant community opposition, I am aware of some community concern, quite understandable community concern in Malaysia, but at least to my knowledge, I've not yet seen a very significant rise in community opposition. So Malaysia, in my view at least, is probably the most advanced in terms of all of the ASEAN nations with respect to its thinking, planning, strategy, and action in order to enable investment in CCS generally and in networks specifically. So Malaysia has announced some time ago its National Energy Transition Roadmap, and in that roadmap, it establishes a target of 3 CCS hubs or clusters but operating by about 2030. And you can see them on this chart here. There are three. The northern cluster, which is centered around Kerteh, I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is an area where there's already a lot of petrochemical industries. And the model here is that the CO2 will be transported to the hub, to the terminal at Kerteh. And then you can also receive CO2 actually from international sources via ships. It'll be transported then by pipeline for offshore storage. Very similar in the southern cluster, also to the east of Peninsular Malaysia, which is based around Kuantan, which is a major port and logistics hub. And it'll collect CO2 from industrial emitters in that region. Also can accept CO2 by ship from international sources and will be transported by pipeline to offshore storage. And then over in Sarawak, you have the Bintulu hub, or eastern cluster. So Bintulu is already a hub for the energy sector, particularly natural gas production. Similarly, CO2 can be aggregated there. It can receive international shipments, and it would be stored offshore, sent to an offshore storage facility via a pipeline. And there's an existing project called the Kasawari project, which is already in construction. That might form part of that cluster as well going forwards. So I think I'll end it there. I am out of time, but looking forward to a good discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alex, for giving us such a good overview of CCS in Southeast Asia. You also gave a simple overview of what carbon capture and storage is and how it works. And this is very helpful for some members of the audience who may not be familiar with the technology. You also talk about CCS as an economic opportunity rather than as a cost, which is good. And then you also talk about the requirements for CCS to work in the setting up of industrial hubs and networks. And I really like what you spoke about in terms of the developments in Malaysia, that it has the right ingredients and that it is the most advanced in developing the CCS industry in Southeast Asia. So thank you very much for your presentation. And now we will move on to our third speaker, Dr. Juniko Pratama, who will share the paths and partnerships for developing low-carbon industrial hubs in Indonesia. Juniko, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Let me share my presentation. Okay. So first, good morning and thank you for the opportunity given by the ICS. I'm Juniko and recently graduated as PhD for Renewable Energy Engineering, doing fuel cell research in South Korea. And then joined the ISR, Institute for Essential Services Reform, as the program manager for industrial decarbonization program. And a little bit for the ISR. ISR also like a global think tank. Local think tank in Indonesia, which are focusing on the energy transition issue, climate issue, and we also want to have communication between the government and the stakeholder. And today I will share insights on the Indonesia paths to low carbon industrial hubs, why they matter, where the region can collaborate, and how we can make them bankable and scalable. So I hope we can have a good discussion and conversation here. So we will start with the Indonesia context, of course, highlight the rationale for the hubs, explore readiness gaps from our latest assessment, and close with key messages and actions. And this is in our study, Indonesia Energy Transition Outlook in 2025. So just a little bit context here. So Indonesia's energy transition outlook is actually improving, but as you know, the right side in the left graphic, emissions from the industrial sector are still growing. As of 2023, coal use in industry remains high, at 56.9%, contributing to a 5% rise in industrial emission. This point the urgent needs for targeted decarbonization within the industrial sector and cluster. And this is also the highlight for our study also, Indonesia Solar Energy Outlook, because we seeing the potential in solar PV in Indonesia, we make this study. But yeah, on the left, you can see why we need clean power faster. Industrial energy use keeps rising actually. And yeah, it's still coal heavy, unfortunately. That's what's driving the upward trend in industrial GHG emissions in the lower chart. And on the right, there are tailwind for solars. And yeah, you can see many number here, but I want to mention in the bottom side, Indonesia actually increasing the capacity from 2020 in 170 megawatt. And now in the 2024 second quarter is 718 megawatt. And this is happening in across captive, off-grid, rooftop, and on-grid segment also. Yeah, I can say that the arc is positive here, but still far below the industry decarbonization will require in the future. Yeah, and let's break that capacity down and see where the rooftop quotas and installed megawatt actually sit. So on the left, the rooftop PV remaining quota actually shows uneven uptake. Yeah, in Indonesia, we know, yeah, if you are Indonesian, you know Java, Madura, and Bali region dominates the demand, while many regions still have large unused quotas. So yeah, the potential is exists, but the utilization execution vary widely. And in the right side, many number here also you can check later, but the takeaways is capacity is building across all the 4 channels, and we need faster permitting, clear interconnection, and flexibility solutions to unlock the large remaining rooftop quotas and keep utility scale moving. And yeah, the next I want to much more giving detail in the subnational level. So in Indonesia, actually, yeah, we already see the national has already potential, but it doesn't automatically translate to the local execution actually. So our readiness mapping shows major gaps between regions. Java, Madura, and Bali, and Sumatra here has relatively stronger governance and grid infrastructure, but areas like Kalimantan in the top and besides that is Sulawesi still face delays in project permitting, land access, and deployment planning. Yeah, so it still need more coordinated planning. And to operationalize the low carbon hubs, we must synchronize national ambition with the subnational delivery. That's what I think very important. And yeah, the key is like capacity building for local governments, incentive alignment, and fast tracking permitting in designated industrial park will be the key. I will give you the slide for the industrial park later. And yeah, this is another study from our side, the energy transition readiness framework. So we already tracked power sector transition since 2021, and this year we expanded it to industry, building, and transport also. New indicators like technology availability, financing access, and policy ambition reflect the real-world decarbonization that needed, and it's not only beyond just power. Our surveys also shows credit is still uneven access to credit, and EV and manufacturing firms access international credit more easily actually. And yeah, you guys right, the developers, especially the smaller player, face major barriers in here. And yeah, one of the reason is like domestic bank remain risk averse, and yeah, project financing is still scarce. So this is one of the weakness point in here, and we need more collaboration in this project financing sector. And yeah, I also put these slides here to give a good milestone. So we have a regional collaboration with the Singapore here. In the picture, there are Energy and Mineral Resources Minister. And yeah, from Singapore is the Minister for Manpower and second Minister for Trade and Industry. Yeah, I can say the momentum is building right now. And yeah, this is happening in June 2025. And yeah, it's covering the green industrial zones, cross-border power trade, and potentially, yeah, we can talk about carbon capture in here. So yeah, I think this is a good milestone. It turns diplomacy, yeah, regional diplomacy in here into shared infrastructure. And yeah, this is the data from the Ministry of Energy also. Yeah, but yeah, there are many number here. For example, we already make the rooftop solar for the industry. This one in the left side is the industry for the pulp and paper, and we have a good number here. Installed capacity until July 2025 is 538 megawatt peak. So it's already good, and we have larger scale solar and also floating solar in Indonesia also. So yeah, these projects can supply industrial zones with clean round the clock electricity when paired with the storage. So yeah, we have also planning the installed storage here. And the next one is from the Ministry of Industries. So we are not actually starting from the scratch. Starting from the 2019, helped by UNIDO, and in collaboration with the MOI, we have piloting eco-industrial park. The program is GEEPP, and yeah, it's bringing circular economy, energy efficiency, and industrial symbiosis all together in the edge of the eco-industrial park. And yeah, it shows that a low carbon hub can function even in emerging economic context. And yeah, not only for the implementation sector also, the MOI also prepared the regulatory framework for the industrial sector decarbonization. So yeah, we have 9 priority industrial subsector: cement, fertilizer, iron steel, pulp and paper, textile, chemical product, glass and ceramics, food beverage, and automotive. And yeah, 4 of this is held by the ISR to be, yeah, we do the research for the technology to be implemented and the costs which are needed in the what's that, the modeling and the how we can decrease the emission carbon. And after the roadmap, we have many also policy that describe the preparation of the MOI in this decarbonization industry sector. Next is because I'm also ex for the green hydrogen, so I also put here. But yeah, the key takeaways is actually Indonesia already planned the clean hydrogen direction. The first one is reducing the dependence on fossil fuels and developing the domestic hydrogen market. And the last one is exporting hydrogen and its derivative, yeah, like ammonia, to leverage our maritime advantages. But where is the Indonesia heading on hydrogen actually? Yeah, fortunately, the Ministry of Energy is moving faster also in this topic, and they have prepared the roadmap also, which the project called Clean Hydrogen Demand reaching 11.8 million tons per year by 2060. So it's a little bit different from the our NZE target in industry sector, which are in 2050, because yeah, green hydrogen is still in the early project So it will finish by 2060. But yeah, the roadmap also outlines the best fit markets, high temperature industries, marine fuels, and steel production. And yes, we can see in the bottom line that several enabling policies are underway, such as the regulation, the standard setting, and classification, which are still being drafted. And yeah, the key challenge, I think it's the same for all of us. Yeah, first is still number one is cost, because yeah, green hydrogen is expensive due to the high prices, capital cost, and yeah, we also have lack infrastructure. Technology readiness is also limited, and yeah, for the policy framework, it's still being underdeveloped, and yeah, still low market adoption. Yeah, so this is require coordinated public-private action, and starting with pilot projects, regulatory sandboxing, and demand aggregation within the industrial hub. So I think, yeah, it can decrease the complexity of this green hydrogen problem. Yeah, so in short, hydrogen is not a silver bullet, but it is a strategic enabler, I think. With the right policy and infrastructure, it can support Indonesia low carbon hubs, serve domestic industry, and position us as a regional hydrogen exporter and hubs. And yeah, this is the key takeaway, because yeah, I'm very happy with this. Indonesia, number one, yeah, Indonesia industrial sector is growing, but yeah, emissions are also rising alongside the demand. The second, low carbon hubs offer shared infrastructure for clean fuel and CCS. And the third, solar potential is high, but yeah, still underutilized. The fourth, financing remains a bottleneck. Yeah, to be honest, and yeah, we need blended finance and for example, conventional capital. And the fifth, regional collaboration is real. And yeah, the example is our MOU with the Singapore that I showed in the previous slide. And the last is readiness is improving, but uneven, especially at the local level. So yeah, I think Indonesia is laying the groundwork for low carbon industrial hubs. But for this to scale, we need much more alignment, especially in the national plans, local execution, shared infrastructure, and inclusive financing. Thank you. This is this last slide, and ISR remain ready to collaborate with government, investor, and knowledge partner towards making these hubs real, bankable, and regionally scalable. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Juniko, for your presentation on the state of development in Indonesia. You shared about the energy landscape in Indonesia and the uneven renewable energy landscape across the country. And then you spoke about the challenges of finance and efforts at regional collaboration. You also mentioned IESR's expanded transition readiness framework. That's quite interesting, and I think that's something we should look at in greater detail to understand Indonesia's industrial transformation. And it's good that you raised the point of the Eco-Industrial Park program. And also useful to hear about Indonesian plans in green hydrogen and how that fits into the overall industrial plan of Indonesia. So thank you very much for your presentation. And now we move on to the question and answer sessions, where I will read out the questions by the audience, and the presenters will then take turns to respond. I noticed that two of the questions have already been answered, but I think in the interest of the audience who are listening in, it's useful to be able to repeat them as part of the webinar. So let me go through the questions one by one. First, a question by Felix Tan. Are there current hubs under development in Southeast Asia? How are hubs going to help with the ASEAN power grid? So, Alex, you have answered that, but I would appreciate if you share your response online to the audience listening in. Peter, you might want to say something as well, right? Okay, so we'll go with that first.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So yes, there are. In addition to the 3 hubs that I mentioned already in Malaysia, there are 2 in Thailand being developed, earlier stages. There are early planning in Indonesia also. Japan has 9 hubs, of which 5, I think, are planning to export carbon dioxide for storage in Southeast Asia. So that's Indonesia or Malaysia, potentially even Australia. South Korea has 2 hubs at least in development, one of which plans to export CO2 to Malaysia through Sarawak for storage. I think that's, and there's several off the north coast of Australia, 3 or 4, I think, off the north coast of Australia, one of which involves Timor-Leste as well. So, so there are, and there's probably others that I've forgotten off the top of my head. So there are several, yes, in development, in early stages of development. And of course, you have Singapore being involved potentially with export of CO2 to Malaysia or Indonesia or Australia, for that matter. So we are seeing quite a lot of activity around the development of hubs, which is very encouraging. With respect to how it helps the electricity grid, so one of the challenges that we have with electricity grids is you need, if you're going to deploy renewable generation capacity, which we must at much greater levels than we currently do, you need to put in place quite a lot of additional infrastructure around transmission distribution, for example, to move the electrons from where you're generating them to where the demand centers are. That needs to happen. One advantage that CCS has is that if you have a thermal power plant like gas or coal with CCS, you don't need any additional electricity transmission infrastructure because you can literally just plug into the existing power grid. But you do need the CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. So what hubs can do is they can enable, through the availability of CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, an opportunity, if it makes sense, for coal or gas generators to establish and access that infrastructure. So that's how it can help the grid. But to be very clear, CCS is not a silver bullet here. It's not 100% of the answer. It's going to be part of the answer. Same with renewables. We're going to need a combination of both to give us the lowest cost, lowest risk, quickest pathway to net zero emissions.
So if I can add to that, Alex, actually follow on from what you've just said now, it's not the silver bullet. I mean, we tend to look at hubs and we've got to be careful that there's a conversation around CCS hubs that obviously link to storage, link specifically to carbon sequestration. There's a conversation about industrial parks, which is something different, and I'll come back to talk about that. There's a conversation around low carbon industrial hubs, which is really about the 4 boxes that I mentioned before: clean electricity, electrons, clean fuels and feedstocks, carbon capture, and sequestration in whatever form, which could include direct air capture, by the way, as we haven't talked about yet, and of course the circular economy, use of waste, etc., etc. So to me, we've got to look at that from very much 2 different perspectives and 2 different financing perspectives. And I think that's important because if you just look at carbon and you just look at what we do with CCUS, you go down one pathway in terms of financing that operation. If, on the other hand, you're looking at an integrated low carbon industrial hub that is going to be the place where you decarbonize, do your power, do your low carbon industry type processes, do your recycling and your waste energy, and you do it all at the same time, you're talking about a very different financing structure. You're talking about a public-private partnership. You're talking about something of national importance from an economic perspective in Indonesia, Vietnam, wherever you operate. So to my mind, the answer is twofold. Number one, you can continue doing what we're doing with carbon hubs. There's nothing wrong with that. But number 2, we've got to begin to start looking at industrial hubs at a national scale in order to attract that finance. And indeed, coming back to the ASEAN power grid and what's happening within that space, Singapore is beginning to look at this from a Jurong Island point of view, from a Tuas and Keppel cluster port and maritime point of view. Malaysia, we've talked about Sarawak, Peninsula Malaysia at Pengerang. Indonesia, I think they are beginning to start looking at the bigger picture in places like Cilegon, and to a certain extent at Batam and the Riau Islands, and of course around East Kalimantan with a new capital and what the hinterland would look like as far as the capital is concerned in East Kalimantan. Vietnam is doing work, the Philippines is doing work, Thailand is doing work, and even Brunei is doing work in this space. So a lot of people are looking at this area, but let's differentiate, please, between carbon hubs that are focused on CCS, industrial parks, which are basically industrial parks. They're about creating a facility for industries to operate in, and low carbon industrial hubs, which is a much bigger type of program. It's a much more nationally focused strategic operation. And that's the conversation we need to have here. And yes, they're absolutely critical, in my opinion, in a world where we're looking for joint infrastructure with the ASEAN power grid. It's not all going to be about centrally driven electricity and power generation on the ASEAN power grid. We are going to see these low carbon industrial hubs being decentralized energy units that will feed into these grids. So they are a fundamental part of how these national and international grids develop going forwards.
Thank you, Peter, for that. Alex, is there any add-on comments you'd like to say in response to Peter? Otherwise, I'll let Juniko have a go at this question if Juniko is interested. Thanks.
I agree entirely with what Peter said. Absolutely. I mean, industrial parks, whether they include or don't include low carbon elements, are in existence today and are an important way of developing industry around the world. I think what we're moving to now is industrial parks that are inherently low carbon as well, bringing together all of those different industry players, bringing together those value chains, developing synergies, providing industrial products, low emission industrial product at the lowest possible price and risk. Absolutely agree.
Park Juniko, is there anything you'd like to add to this question?
Yes, and I think Peter already mentioned several of industrial hubs in Indonesia, in Cilegon. Actually, that's very good, and it's a good sign because it's yeah, we can see now it's good and already established, but the preparation is actually along the way from maybe 2000 and early 2000. And also I already put in my slide about the MOU with the Singapore, which are mentioning about the cross-border electricity trade, right? So it's already happening now, but yeah, I think Indonesia cannot cross into the Australia because the location is very far. But yeah, Singapore, Malaysia, it's already opportunity there. So yeah, just I hope it will develop more in the future.
Okay, I'll move on to the second question. Second question is by my colleague, Ms. Sharon Seah, who's the coordinator for the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ICIS. She's asking, I will rephrase a little bit. She's asking whether CCS or CCUS projects are able to generate what they call ITMOS, the internationally transferable mitigation outcomes under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. I'll keep her question simple, and not just CCS, but say the development of such low carbon industrial hubs. Do they have a role to play in the context of Article 6?
Yes.
I will let Peter go first, followed by Alex, followed by Juniko. Thank you.
So me quick, and I'll pass over to Alex because he probably will want to talk about this. But again, the development of international tradable credits is still very much under discussion. Clearly, if you go to Europe, CBAM has now is in the process of taking effect. So the ability to trade CO2 and create a credit mechanism and a credit platform is developing. There is no question around that. There is another area that is beginning to be looked at within in the area of voluntary compliance as well as potentially mandatory compliance, which is this whole issue of CDR, i.e. CO2 reduction certificates. Now, there is a debate around Article 6, and it'll be interesting to see where things go when the next COP takes place around how CDRs operate, as to whether there is the ability within an international framework to create a cross-border mechanism, or whether at the end of the day you're going to need regionally specific, more sector-specific pricing of carbon that allows that CDR certificate system to develop within the context of carbon removal. So the answer is yes, it's developing, it's evolving, it's complex. CBAM has come up with a mechanism that kind of works in Europe. It's, there are people who are saying, yeah, we're moving down the right track. Others are still debating it. So over to Alex to maybe talk about it from a CCS specific point of view, because I mean, clearly it's a very, very core topic and it's a very core question.
Yeah, I don't have much to add when it comes to Article 6. You're right. Text is bracketed, to use the jargon. It's still being developed. We are seeing methods being developed that enable the quantification and verification of abatement achieved through carbon capture and storage. And some of that already exists in compliance schemes, like here in Australia, for example, and in Europe. But we're seeing also voluntary carbon markets develop methods, which the intent of which is to enable the creation of carbon credits, which are traded on voluntary platforms, but subject to all of the rigor that's necessary to ensure the abatement is real, additional, etc. So it's still a work in progress at the moment. At the moment, it's not Article 6, 6.2, 6.4. They're really not enabling the creation of ITMOs, as I understand it. I'm not an expert in UNFCCC guidelines, UNFCCC requirements. But there's still work to do before really that they can be operationalized.
Yeah, I mean, just adding a little thing around sort of low carbon industrial hubs again, not just specifically CCS. I mean, the other attraction that I haven't mentioned before is that if you build a low carbon industrial hub correctly, it also becomes a site that is attractive to the industries of the future, particularly the ones that are forced into net zero. So, for example, if you start looking at data centers, if you begin to start looking at the Amazons, etc., that have very strong net zero targets, they are not going to invest in high carbon areas. They are going to want to invest and put their bases in low carbon industrial hubs. Now, that has an intrinsic value in terms of financing, and it's also an intrinsic way of incentivizing that financing. Hence the fact that I think over time, you're going to see countries and regions develop their own CDR certification schemes that will make it attractive for these future industries to invest in these low carbon industrial hubs going forwards.
In fact, we're already starting to see that happen in the United States with Chevron and Exxon.
Correct.
Both working on gas-fired power station with CCS specifically to power AI centers. And they would build them around the existing infrastructure, CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, mostly that Exxon owns and operates, formerly owned by Denbury until Exxon acquired them. So it's already starting where the infrastructure is there. We are already starting to see projects develop around that infrastructure to utilize that infrastructure and provide very low emissions electricity to power AI data centers in the United States. And I agree with you, Peter. I expect to see exactly the same thing happen in this region once that infrastructure is available.
Juniko, is there anything you'd like to add on this point, on Article 6?
Yeah, in Indonesia context, actually, not so much about that, because yeah, even in the latest decarbonization roadmap, actually we put this CCUS, but in Indonesia we only mention CCU actually in the last part of the roadmap. Yeah, after we put the lowest hanging fruits and other pillar of decarbonization as part of the abatements category, and this CCU is also just having around 24%, and we put in the carbon removal category. But at least, yeah, Indonesia already have thoughts in there, the government, and you know when the carbon market happening, and yeah, at least we can join the party there. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. I will move on to the next question. It's by another colleague, Miss Joanne Lin. She's asking, how can CCS or CCUS be used to complement rather than slow down the shift to renewables? And do governments and companies see it as a cheaper alternative to renewable energy? I will sort of rephrase it as well because I also have a similar question. Basically, how do you see the balance between integrating CCS versus accelerating renewable energy and other decarbonization solutions? Should the industrial hubs prioritize one over the other? So I will let Alex go first this time, followed by Peter, followed by Juniko.
So we need both, right? We need enormous amounts of CCS and we need enormous amounts of renewable energy. I think the definition of success here shouldn't be which industry has the most investment in the shortest time. The definition of success is what is the lowest cost, lowest risk pathway to achieving our emissions abatement targets, net zero, say. And in some circumstances, CCS will be the best option. In fact, it'll be the only option because there are no other technologies available to displace, for example, process emissions. In some cases, it'll be renewables where you need electricity. And whichever is the best option in that specific circumstance should be the option that receives the investment and gets developed most quickly. So there's plenty of circumstances where I've said to people, CCS make no sense there. Plant some trees, put up some wind turbines. The important factor here is we must always choose the best option for the circumstance rather than choose the technology first and try and find a way to make it work in any particular circumstance. In some cases, that'll be CCS. In other cases, that'll be renewables. One thing I will say, though, is that as the penetration of renewable generation increases in any particular grid, once you get up towards 60, 70, 80%, then CCS starts to become more and more critical because you start to require energy storage at the very high levels of non-dispatchable power. And as of today, at least, energy storage is terribly expensive and really can't service that need. So you need dispatchable low emissions electricity, and that's either nuclear if that's available to you, or hydro if that's available to you, or it's coal or gas with carbon capture and storage. The more renewables enter the grid, the more CCS becomes valuable in decarbonising that last 10, 20, 15%, whatever it is for a particular grid. It'll change for each grid at the lowest possible cost to ensure you have a resilient grid that is able to meet demand when it's required 24/7.
So adding to that, Alex, and we're going to agree on just about everything throughout this. But to me, obviously, there is no one size fits all industrial hub. You're going to develop an industrial hub based on the geography and the demographics of that geography and the resources available to you. So clearly, where are we seeing industrial hubs develop? Number one, clearly where you're bringing gas ashore or you have a gas processing facility. Clearly you're going to be looking at CCS if you can export the CCS and it becomes the beginning of a hub, but it's not the end of the hub, as we're seeing in the UK now with hydrogen and other technologies beginning to start playing together as those hubs develop. There are going to be other industrial hubs that have no CCS advantage whatsoever, and there is no export route for that CCS. So clearly CCS is off the table. It's going to be a completely different form of hub that will develop that still, hopefully, will deliver clean electrons, clean fuels and feedstocks for whatever processes you put in place, have a way of reducing carbon because you will still need to sequestrate that carbon somewhere. And it may not be at that site. It may be by developing a direct air capture plant in another site. As the way of sequestration, but there will still be a carbon sequestration solution. And then, of course, the circular economy and the use of waste and resource efficiency. So again, those 4 boxes play, but CCS may be completely out of the money in that particular area, all right? And that needs to be put into context. Secondly, bear in mind, where are you going to build these kinds of hubs? The likelihood is that you're going to build them at brownfield sites, right? Because clearly, if you've got a gas processing plant or you're in that business, you've already got the beginning of something you can build around. If you've got a refining and petrochemicals plant, clearly you've already got part of the processes that can develop biofuels, for example, and other solutions. So you're obviously going to try, as is the case with Chilagon, if you've already got industry there, they are brownfield sites that are going to be much cheaper to develop than greenfield sites. But what you've got to do, and where I think we are now at, is be very clear about how you are going to developing that site. You need a strategy that will deliver that hub appropriate for that geography, appropriate for those resources, and appropriate for connectivity into the rest of your economy in whichever country you're in. And that's the approach we need to adopt. That's the work that we need to do now in every country. It's not a region or a country specific point of view. Every country needs to make its own decision about what those hubs look like from an economic competitive perspective.
Thank you, Peter. Juniko, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, I'm agree on all of you actually in your saying. However, I want to also emphasize that our discussion and our talking in here now, we have to know that the cost actually that we have to pay if we are not doing both of it. So yeah, cost of doing nothing, we can say about that. And yeah, it will affect our climate, environment, and health, and our well-being, right? So think about that in the future. And yeah, we can say that how much it costs, both of the FA and the CCUS or CCU. Yeah, I think it's still lower compared with the cost of doing nothing that we have to pay in the future. And yeah, in Indonesia context, what path we have to adopt, either FA and the CCUS, we have to adopt the most efficient and effective both in cost and implementative side actually, because right now even in the industrial association and yeah, industrial sector between the stakeholder, it's still pros and cons about this development. And yeah, we have to make sure that the regulation is firm. We already think about the implementation as well, and yeah, it's efficient and effective both in the cost and implementation. That's all.
Thank you. I'd like to move to a finance question. In fact, there are 2 finance questions here. I will try to integrate both of them. First question is with regards to blended finance by Felix Loh. He's asking whether there is a need for blended finance, and there's a lot of blended finance being the key to unlocking capital, more like a general question. So he wants to understand why. And this sort of ties into, Peter, your presentation where you talk about the essential enablers for low carbon hub development. It's tied to a question by John Ure. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. So you mentioned that you need policy and regulation as well as infrastructure and infrastructure integration to sort of unlock the finance and as a means for risk mitigation. So he's asking, these are necessary factors, but are they in themselves sufficient? So broadly speaking, for all 3 speakers, where's the money going to come from for the development of such projects? And what kind of role do you see the private sector play alongside the governments and international institutions? So I will let Peter go first, then Juniko, then Alex.
So I think the important thing, and you know, this is arguable because, you know, I think there's a debate around this, but the important thing to recognize is when we look at the development of low carbon industrial hubs and where they will sit within the economy of any nation, we are looking at a fundamental piece of infrastructure development. We are not looking at a commodity-based investment or an investment in any single technology. What we're looking for, therefore, is the same as building a toll road or a railway or whatever, but in a very much more integrated technology perspective. To my mind, that desperately and will definitely need blended finance because public money will be needed, government money will be needed to put on the table, private participants, and there will be a number of different stakeholders with different technologies will play a part, also need to come together. And everybody will basically need to come together as a consortium to deliver that infrastructure development going forwards. Now, the question is, who owns that consortium? Is it government? No, because private sector are not going to effectively rely on the government as the leaders of that consortium because the government may play around with what the private sector gets. Likewise, can private sector do it alone? No, they can't do it without the government. So to me, the issue here is 100% do we need public-private finance? 100% do we need blended finance? But it needs to be developed by separate consortia with separate balance sheets that basically put that money together and manage it in the interests of developing that low carbon industrial hub. Okay, just like, as I say, building a toll road or a railway or whatever. So we've got to get away from price of carbon, commodity prices, how much can the oil and gas companies make out of a molecule of carbon being taken off to a storage site, into something that is much more holistic and joint infrastructure based, that may not make commodity rates of return of 15 to 20%, may only make 8 to 12% rates of return. But if they're supported as projects of national importance, those projects can be done as long as they are supported and well supported by a consortium that brings public money, private money into a blended finance solution. And that, to me, is the way forwards.
Thank you. Juniko, any thoughts on this?
Yeah. So why is the blended finance necessary? So one of the point is the high upfront costs and long payback periods, because you know, clean energy infrastructure, for example, solar and storage, hydrogen, CCS, actually often requires large capital outlays. And yeah, but the returns comes over like very long, 15 and 25 years. So commercial lenders typically favor short terms and low risk investment. And yeah, public concessional finance can help absorb this first loss of extended tenure. And then we have also a problem with the perceived risk, which are higher in the emerging market. So we see that many investors actually see the policy uncertainty, currency fluctuation, and offtake risk as a deal breaker. So blended finance can provide as a guarantees, insurance, and favorability gap funding to de-risk these elements. And when we talk about the, for example, MDBs or governments already put their effort in the game or skin in the game, it builds confidence for the commercial financiers to follow. So yeah, I hope we can put this into our mind. And yeah, one of the problems also, you know, aggregating small project into investable vehicles. So in industrial parks and clean tech pilots, actually, some of them is too small or fragmented to attract capital at scale. So this blended finance can be used to create the hub level platforms that aggregate and yeah, also a guarantor demands and reduce the transaction cost. And yeah, finally, we can say that for hydrogen, green hydrogen and CCS, this technology don't yet have established price benchmark. or offtake certainty. So the blended finance can also help structure contracts for difference, for example, and minimum revenue guarantees or anchor offtake support. So yeah, blended finance is not just a nice to have, but yeah, we can say it's a transitional tool to save risks and yeah, make a crowd in capital and unlock market that would otherwise, yeah, it will remain stuck in that problem. That's all, Peter, Chris.
Thank you, Juniko. Alex, any thoughts on this?
Well, I think Juniko and Peter covered it very well. I would just add one other thing, and that is that we're on the clock here. So all of our countries have set targets for emissions reduction, quite aggressive targets, net zero in every case, pretty much. If governments sit back and allow the market just to operate without further regulation, without further policy support, without the provision of finance from public sources, for example, to accelerate the investment in CCS and other low emission technologies, by the way, at a rate faster than they would otherwise get investment, we're not going to achieve those targets. So I agree with absolutely everything that Juniko and Peter said. I'd just add that there's also the dimension of meeting targets that governments have set. And in order to meet those targets, more needs to be done than what is currently being done now. And blended finance to help reduce the risk, financial risk, private sector financial risk, allow private sector capital to achieve at least the levels of return that they need to achieve to make the investment, because they can put their money elsewhere. Unless that happens, the investment won't come, the facilities won't be built, the emissions reduction targets won't be met.
Thank you very much, Alex. Moving away from the question of finance to cooperation, just a very general question. I mean, we are talking about individual countries at this point, Malaysia, Indonesia, or other, what Peter has mentioned as national level projects. But what kind of regional collaboration and knowledge sharing opportunities or requirements do we need to enable the development of the low carbon industrial hubs across the region? Is there room for deeper collaboration? Is there a role, for example, for ASEAN to play? Is there anything you'd like to see? I'll start with Peter first, and then Alex, and then Juniko. Thank you.
The simple answer is yes, there's a massive role. Again, I sense there is a recognition, especially in a Trump world, that the region has got to get its act together a lot more. And I also, as we've talked about with low carbon industrial hubs, is that no one size fits all in terms of what these hubs look like. You can't do the same in Malaysia as you would do in Indonesia. Every country has got to play increasingly to the economic advantages it has. There's a question here about biofuels and biofuels feedstocks. It's the same thing. If we all try and do exactly the same thing, then we're competing against each other. Whereas if we actually try and find a way of creating competitive advantage, and in so doing, scaling up more and creating more opportunity to then compete with the rest of the world more effectively, that may be more advantageous than actually, everybody doing their own thing behind their backs. So I suspect there is absolute scope for working together regionally on these ideas of industrial hubs. And indeed, I suspect even further back to blended finance, we are increasingly going to see multilateral finance, i.e. finance from Indonesia, from Singapore, wherever, being invested in other neighboring countries and vice versa. Because that's the way to create security, is for the region to play its game more closely together. And that's going to involve money as well. So to me, blended finance is going to come less from America and the Trump world, and hopefully potentially even less from China, and is going to be more driven by regional economics playing a more and more important role going forwards in this very unpredictable world that we now live in.
Any points on ASEAN as an institution? Is there anything you'd like to see, Peter?
I think we're beginning to see it. We're beginning to see ASEAN taking some of these issues a little bit more seriously instead of being a talking shop, in very simple terms.
Okay, next speaker, Alex.
Absolutely, there needs to be close collaboration and cooperation between nations. So if you consider what's required to establish transboundary CCS value chain, so export, for example, from Singapore to Malaysia or Indonesia, they need to agree on a whole bunch of things. They need to agree on how mitigation outcomes will be allocated. They need to agree on carbon accounting standards and processes to ensure the integrity of carbon accounting. They need to agree on how liability is going to be managed. They need to agree on the standards and technical standards for the CO2 itself, what purity, what temperature, what pressure, etc. Ideally, if all of those things are agreed amongst ASEAN nations, they need to agree on how they regulate storage, because one country exporting its CO2 needs to be happy with the way another country is regulating that CO2 once it's received to ensure it's stored permanently. So in order for ASEAN countries to build this network in the most efficient way possible, which in the ideal world would mean CO2 could go into this ASEAN network anywhere, and it doesn't matter where it goes, you know that it meets the requirements and it can go to any storage resource anywhere. That gives you the maximum interoperability, the maximum flexibility for the operation of that network, and therefore lowest cost, lowest risk. So that's the ideal solution. If you look at what's happening in Europe around the Lungskip Northern Lights, for example, the benefit they have, they operate within the European Union. So, you know, they have the European CCS directive that sets a standard, a common approach to regulation of CCS. Carbon accounting is dealt with through the European ETS. So these things are enabling international trade in CO2 transport and storage. ASEAN doesn't have that. So ASEAN needs to develop that in order so that there are no non-tariff trade barriers to the trade of CO2 transport and storage, which we know will reduce the cost of abatement and enable the development of new industries.
Thank you very much. I think the keyword here is harmonization across the region. So you put it across very well. So Juniko?
Yes. Of course, it's very important to have a dialogue. So just putting some problem context here. So Southeast Asia actually is one of the region we know that most vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. And yeah, all the 10 ASEAN countries have made commitments to reduce the green gas emission. And yeah, we can see also the implementation already happening there and here. But in reality, the fossil fuels still dominate, right, in an energy mix of most ASEAN member states. So actually, I also want to promote our action here. So our CEO, Pak Fabi, is already spoke about this during the regional dialogue in the Realizing ASEAN's Energy Future, Turning Vision into Action with Southeast Asia Energy Transformation Initiative. So you want to make some initiative here, movement. So it's an event hosted by ISR, Stanley Center for Peace and Security, and Solar Energy Research Institute, and JD Dialogues. So he mentioned to speed up the energy transition. We want to focus in 4 main action. First, the adoption, acceleration, and integration of clean energy mix, strengthen the green finance and investment mechanism, position ASEAN as a hub for clean energy and manufacturing and trade, and enhance policy coordination and workforce development. So I think by taking this step, and this is one of the strategy for narrative communication, right? We have to have strong commitment, and I think by taking this step, Southeast Asia can not only build clean energy infrastructure, but also develop its human capital and position itself as a global hub. So the target not only for the SEA itself, but for global hub for renewable energy industries. So that's it.
Thank you very much. It's already 11:35. We've gone over time, and I think we had very useful and fruitful conversation here. It'll be interesting to see how things have developed several years down the road. And so I will end the webinar here. Thank you to our speakers our audience and the ICS events team behind the scenes for making this event possible. I will now return the floor to the MC. Jia Hui, please.
Thank you to all the panelists for a really insightful session, and thank you to the audience as well for your kind support and active participation. So if you would like to be kept informed on activities and events in the future by the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program, please sign up for updates at the links which I have just pasted in the chat box. So thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Have a great day ahead.